The restaurant where I met Isabella is still there. I know this because I walked past it 3 weeks after she disappeared. I don't know why I did that. Some instinct, maybe. Or maybe just the absence of anywhere else to go. I had been walking a lot in those weeks, just walking. The city is good for that. It doesn't ask you anything. It just keeps going, which is either comforting or unbearable, depending on the day. The same tables outside, the same smell of feijoada coming through the door in the late afternoon. The same man at the counter who used to nod at me every time I walked in, like we shared some small understanding that neither of us had ever put into words. I walked past and he nodded, and I nodded back and kept walking. Everything exactly as it was. Which is the thing about betrayal that nobody really prepares you for. The world doesn't register it. A city of 7 million people goes right on being itself. The coffee is still good. The light on the water is still beautiful in the late afternoon. The man at the counter still nods. The fruit vendor on the corner still calls out the same things in the same order. The tram still runs up to Santa Teresa at the same times it always has. Only you are different. Only you have been rearranged. My name is Richard Calloway. I am 68 years old. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee on a Tuesday in March 1956, the second of 3 children, in a brick house on a street that no longer looks anything like I remember it. My father was an accountant. My mother taught second grade for 31 years. We were a quiet family, in the way that families are quiet when everyone in them has decided, without discussing it, that the important things don't need to be said out loud. I grew up and became a teacher myself. High school history. 34 years at the same school in East Nashville, in what was essentially the same classroom, with the same view of the same parking lot that I somehow never got tired of looking at. I'm not sure why. There was something about the parking lot in winter, when it was empty on weekend mornings and the light came through the trees at the edge of it, that I always found unexpectedly beautiful. I noticed it every year and never mentioned it to anyone, which is, I think, a fairly accurate portrait of who I am. I was not an unhappy man in Nashville. I want to say that clearly at the beginning, because I think the kind of story I am about to tell tends to attract a certain interpretation, that the person who made the mistake must have been unhappy, must have been running from something, must have been desperate in some fundamental way that made them vulnerable. And while I understand that interpretation, it is not entirely accurate. I was not running from Nashville. I had a good life there, a real one, with weight and texture and people I loved. The most important of those people was Carol. We met in September 1987 at a faculty mixer at the beginning of the school year. She had just transferred from a school in Memphis to work as the school librarian. I noticed her because she was reading at the party, a biography of Robert Moses, the urban planner, which I thought was either the most pretentious thing I had ever seen at a social event or the most honest. I decided I needed to find out which, so I walked over and asked her what she thought of him. She said, "I think he was a man who confused power with virtue, which is the most common mistake intelligent people make." And then she looked at me and said, "Do you want to sit down, or are you just passing through?" I sat down. We talked for 3 hours. I drove home at 11 o'clock at night and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, thinking about the conversation before I went inside. We were married in June 1990. We had 2 children, James, who lives in Dayton and works in logistics, and Patricia, who lives in Seattle and works in hospital administration. We bought a house in East Nashville in 1991, a brick colonial with a front porch and a yard that was too big for the amount of time we had to maintain it, and we lived in that house for 29 years. I want to tell you something about those 29 years that is difficult to say without sounding like a greeting card, but that I think is important to the story. They were good years. Not easy, We had the same difficulties every family has: money troubles in the early years, the particular strain of raising teenagers, a period in our late 40s when we were both tired in ways we couldn't quite explain to each other. But they were good years. We were good together. Carol was a librarian who read 2 or 3 books a week for her entire adult life, which means she knew something about almost everything and had opinions about most of it. And her opinions were usually worth hearing, even when I disagreed with them, which was fairly often. She had a garden she tended with the same precision she brought to cataloging, everything in its proper place, properly supported, given what it needed to grow. She made the best coffee I have ever had in my life. She laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which I always found endearing and which drove Patricia absolutely crazy. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on a Thursday in October 2017. She was 61 years old. Our son James had just gotten engaged. We had been talking about where to travel when I retired, which was still 2 or 3 years away. We had been talking about Portugal specifically. Carol had read something about the light in Lisbon and wanted to see it. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The oncologist at Vanderbilt was thorough and kind and used the vocabulary that oncologists use, and Carol listened to all of it with the same careful attention she brought to everything, the same attention she would have brought to a complicated reference question at the library, the same quality of focus that made people feel, when she was listening to them, that what they were saying genuinely mattered. When he finished, she asked 2 questions. She asked, "How much time do we realistically have?" And she asked, "What does the end usually feel like for this particular cancer?" Not what can be done, not what are the options. She wanted to understand what was actually going to happen. That was Carol. She always wanted to understand what was actually going to happen. The answer to the first question was 3 to 6 months, possibly less given the staging. The answer to the second question was that for most people it was a gradual quieting, less pain than many cancers at the end, but a significant loss of energy and presence in the final weeks. It took 11 weeks. Those 11 weeks were not what either of us expected, and I have thought about how to describe them many times in the 7 years since, and I have never found the right words. What I can say is that they felt, in some ways, like the most concentrated version of our entire marriage. Everything compressed into 11 weeks, all the things we had been meaning to say and had kept postponing because there was always more time. There wasn't more time. There almost never is. She died on a Tuesday morning in December 2017, at home, in the room we had shared for 27 years. James and Patricia were both there. It was very quiet at the end, the particular silence of a room that has just changed. I don't tell you this to make you feel a particular thing. I tell you because it is the foundation of everything that comes after. Not the excuse. I don't believe in excuses, and I don't think what happened to me in Rio requires one. But the context. A man who has lost the thing that organized his life is different from the man he was before. His edges are different. His attention goes to different places. He is, in certain specific and important ways, more available to be hurt, because the defenses that experience builds over a lifetime, the instincts that say, be careful here, go slowly here, don't believe this quite yet. Those defenses are built partly from caring about what you have to lose. And when you have lost the main thing, the defenses weaken. I know that now. I did not know it when I arrived in Rio. The 3 years after Carol died were the most difficult of my life. I went back to teaching in January 2018 because I didn't know what else to do, because the structure of the school day gave the weeks a shape they would not otherwise have had, and because I was afraid of what might happen to me if I stayed home alone with no reason to get up at any particular time. James came from Dayton every 2 or 3 months. Patricia called twice a week, every week, without fail, for 3 years. They worried about me in the way that adult children worry about a surviving parent, constantly, across a distance, and without quite knowing what to do because there is, ultimately, nothing to do. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a country you move through, at your own pace, on your own terms, and all anyone can do for you is call twice a week to make sure you are still moving. I retired in June 2020, a few years earlier than I had planned. The pandemic had made the classroom feel strange in ways I couldn't reconcile with 34 years of what teaching had meant to me, and I found my patience for the work diminishing in ways that weren't fair to the students. It was time. I sold the house in East Nashville in September 2020. The neighborhood had changed considerably. We had bought in 1991 when the street was quiet and modest, and by 2020, it was trendy and expensive and full of people who weren't from Nashville and didn't particularly need to be anywhere specific. The offer was generous. I took it. After the house sale and my retirement accounts and the life insurance policy Carol had maintained for 20 years, I had $470,000. I want you to let that number sit for a moment, because I think it is important to understand what it represented. It was not just money. It was the physical residue of a life, 34 years of work, 29 years of a house, a marriage, a woman who had kept a life insurance policy for 2 decades because she believed in being prepared for the things you can't prevent. I had not touched a dollar of it in almost 3 years. It sat in a Chase account, and I looked at the balance occasionally and felt, each time I looked at it, a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt and a kind of paralysis that I couldn't quite explain. Spending it felt wrong. Not spending it felt wrong. I could not find the right relationship to it, so I did nothing. And the months passed, and the money sat there, and I lived on my pension and my Social Security and was careful with everything, the way people are careful when being careful is the only thing they feel competent to do. Then, in the fall of 2021, I started watching YouTube. I am not entirely sure how it started. I had been watching more television than usual. This is common in grief, I have since learned, the passive comfort of other people's voices in the room. And at some point, the algorithm shifted from whatever I had been watching toward travel content, specifically toward content about retirement abroad. There were hundreds of these channels. Men and women my age, sometimes older, living in places I had barely thought about. Portugal, Mexico, Costa Rica, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brazil. They filmed their daily lives with an earnestness that I found, at first, slightly strange, and then, increasingly, genuinely moving. The cost of a good apartment in Lisbon, the quality of the coffee in Mexico City, the beach an hour from Chiang Mai, the ease of the lifestyle, the sense, and this was the thing that kept bringing me back, the sense that it was not too late. That phrase, not too late. I noticed how often it appeared in the content I was watching, and I noticed how much I needed to believe it. Brazil appeared frequently, and Rio specifically. There was one channel I watched more than any other, a man about my age, retired, who had been living in Rio for 3 years and filmed himself walking along the Copacabana promenade most mornings. Just walking. The camera moving at the pace of a man who has nowhere urgent to be, and the ocean on one side, and the mosaic sidewalk, and the palm trees, and in the background, the shape of the mountains that make Rio look like a city that was designed by someone who wanted to remind you constantly how small you are. He talked as he walked, about the bakery he had found, about the Portuguese lesson he'd had that morning, about the neighbor who had explained something about the neighborhood's history, about the particular quality of the light at 7 in the morning, which he described as the kind of light that makes you feel you are seeing things for the first time, even when you have seen them 100 times before. I watched that video 50 or 60 times. I watched it the way you watch something that is showing you something about yourself that you have not been able to see directly. I called James in November 2021 and told him I was thinking about moving to Brazil. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the direct way he has always had, "Dad, you've been thinking about this for almost a year. Either do it or stop thinking about it." He was right. I booked the flight 4 days later. I arrived in Rio de Janeiro on a Thursday evening in January 2022. The taxi came in from the airport through the tunnel, and then suddenly the city appeared. Not gradually, the way most cities reveal themselves from the air, but all at once, emerging from the tunnel into the lights and the noise and the specific smell of the bay at night, which I have tried to describe many times and never managed to, except to say that it smelled like a place where a great deal of life was happening simultaneously. I checked into a small hotel in Flamengo and sat on the edge of the bed and said out loud to no one, "I am 67 years old and I am in Rio de Janeiro." I felt something I had not felt in 5 years. I felt present. Not happy, necessarily, not yet, but present. In the room, in my body, in the moment. It was like a window opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. I spent 3 weeks in Rio before flying home to pack. I walked until my feet hurt every day, and then kept walking. I took the metro to neighborhoods I had no particular reason to visit. I took the tram to Santa Teresa on my 5th day and walked through the streets for an entire afternoon. And by the end of that afternoon, I understood where I wanted to live. Not in a tourist neighborhood, not somewhere I had seen in YouTube videos, but there, in that neighborhood on the hill, with the old colonial buildings and the cats sleeping on the walls and the bougainvillea coming over the fences and the particular quiet that settles over it in the early morning before the city has fully woken up. I came back in March 2022 with 4 large suitcases and a carry-on, and a resolve that felt, for the first time in years, like something I had earned rather than manufactured. I found the apartment in Santa Teresa through a woman I met at a language school. A ground-floor unit with a small courtyard, terracotta tile floors, wooden shutters on the windows that let in the morning light at an angle that made the room feel like it was from another century. The landlord was a retired architect named Sebastião, who lived on the floor above and who had, I would learn, very particular opinions about bossa nova, about the correct way to prepare moqueca, and about the general direction of the neighborhood over the past 30 years, all of which he expressed at length and with considerable passion on Sunday afternoons. He was also, without making a production of it, kind. He left mangoes outside my door when the tree in his courtyard produced more than he could use. He told me, during our first week, which streets to avoid after dark, and which bars had the best draft beer, and which mechanic in the neighborhood would not overcharge me. And he said all of this in the matter-of-fact tone of someone providing practical information rather than performing generosity. I was happy in that apartment. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because the story that comes after can make it sound like Rio was only ever a mistake, and that is not true. Those first months, before Isabela, before Fabio, before I understood what was happening to me, those months were genuinely good. I studied Portuguese every morning. I walked the city every afternoon. I made small progress on understanding where I was and who the people around me were. I had conversations, broken, halting, occasionally embarrassing conversations, with vendors and neighbors and the woman at the language school who had the patient, slightly resigned expression of someone who has been correcting the same mistakes for 20 years. I was, for the first time in 5 years, a person who was actually living his life rather than waiting for it to resume. I found Doña Marlena's restaurant in Gloria about 3 weeks after I arrived. A small place on a side street, 6 tables inside and 2 outside, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard that changed every day. I went in because I was hungry, and it was there, and the smell coming through the door was the kind of smell that bypasses your judgment entirely and goes directly to the part of you that simply needs to eat. The moqueca was extraordinary. Not just good, the kind of dish that makes you stop whatever you were thinking about and be entirely in the moment of eating it. I have eaten at many restaurants in many cities, and I can tell you that that particular quality, the quality of a dish that demands your full attention, is rarer than it should be. I went back the next week, and the week after that. By my second month in Rio, I was going 3 times a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and eventually Saturdays as well. And Doña Marlena had started bringing my food out before I ordered, which is the highest form of hospitality I know. She was 72 years old and had been cooking in that room since 1987, and she had the specific authority of someone who has been right about something important for a very long time. She corrected my Portuguese without making me feel corrected. She sat across from me occasionally, between the lunch and dinner service, and told me things about the neighborhood, who had lived there, what had changed, what had not changed, and, in her opinion, should not. It was at one of those tables, on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, that I first saw Isabela. She was sitting alone at the table by the window, having lunch, reading something on her phone. When Doña Marlene brought my food out, Isabela looked up and said something in Portuguese that I didn't fully catch, and Doña Marlene laughed, a surprised laugh, the kind that gets pulled out of you before you can decide whether to let it go. I asked Doña Marlene, after Isabela had looked back at her phone, what she had said. Doña Marlene told me, "That man orders the same thing every time. He must really trust you." I thought about that for a moment. Then I asked Doña Marlene to tell her in Portuguese that the moqueca was worth trusting. There was a pause. I heard Doña Marlene relay this in Portuguese. Then Isabela looked up from her phone and looked at me directly for the first time, and her expression was the expression of someone deciding whether a thing is worth engaging with. She said, in English, "Fair point." We talked for 40 minutes that afternoon. She told me she was 41 years old, that she had grown up in Niterói and moved to Rio in her 20s, that she had been divorced for 3 years, that she had a daughter named Ana, who was 13 and lived in Sao Paulo with her ex-husband during the week and spent every other weekend in Rio. She worked for a small company that organized corporate events, conferences, product launches, the kind of gatherings that large companies arrange when they want their employees to feel seen without actually seeing them. She asked about Nashville, about what I had taught, whether I'd liked it, whether I missed it. She asked these questions with the quality of attention that I had noticed in her from the first moment, a focused, specific attention that made you feel that your answers were genuinely being considered, rather than merely received. She did not ask about money. She did not ask what had brought me to Rio, not in any way that required me to discuss finances. She asked about the city, about what I had noticed, about what had surprised me. She asked whether I had been to Santa Teresa yet, and when I said I lived there, she looked genuinely pleased, like someone who has recommended a restaurant to a friend and learned the friend has already discovered it. We said goodbye an hour later, and I walked home through the neighborhood and felt, for the first time in many years, that I had had a conversation that left me more alive than I had been before it. We saw each other at the restaurant 2 more times over the following 2 weeks, always by coincidence, always briefly. Then, on a Thursday evening, she mentioned a bar in Santa Teresa, an old place near the tram stop that had live music on Friday evenings. the kind of place that required knowing someone who knew about it to find. She said, "If you haven't been, you should go." And then, after a pause, she said, "I sometimes go on Friday evenings if you wanted company." I said I would like that very much. It was on that Friday, 6 weeks after we met, sitting at a small table on a terrace with the city spread out below us, that I told Isabela about Carol. It happened gradually. I had mentioned Carol in passing earlier in the evening, something about the garden, about plants I had tried to keep alive and failed at, and Isabela had noticed the way I stopped when I said her name. She didn't ask anything directly. She just let the silence sit there, the way a good listener does, giving you room to decide what to do with it. So I told her. Everything. How we met, what our life had been, the diagnosis and what the oncologist had said, and the way Carol had listened to all of it with that focused attention she brought to everything. The 11 weeks, the particular quality of the silence in the room when it was over. The 5 years after, the specific texture of that kind of grief, not the dramatic grief of the movies, but the quiet daily grief of making coffee for one, and walking past the garden she had tended, and reading books she had recommended, and finding her annotations in the margins, and not knowing what to do with them. Isabela listened for 2 hours. She did not interrupt. She did not offer consolations or suggest silver linings. She did not do any of the things that people do when they are uncomfortable with grief and want to move past it. She simply listened, with the full weight of her attention, and when I finished, she reached across the small table and took my hand and held it, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Below us, the city continued. Motorbikes on the hill, music from a bar somewhere below, the distant, constant sound of the bay. Then Isabela said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." I didn't answer. I looked at the lights on the water and thought, yes, she was. I understood that night, sitting on that terrace, that I was in love with Isabela. The understanding arrived completely formed, the way certain realizations do, not as a question that develops gradually, but as a fact that has been true for some time and has only now been noticed. It terrified me. It also felt, for the first time in 6 years, like something worth being terrified about. Like proof that the part of me capable of that feeling was still there, still intact, still waiting. I rode home in a taxi and sat in the courtyard of my apartment for a long time, listening to Sebastião's music coming through the ceiling above me, and thought, this city is either going to save me or destroy me. I had no idea, yet, which one it would be. I want to be careful about how I tell this part of the story. Not because I am protecting her. I am past that. I want to be careful because I think the story is only useful, and I do think it can be useful, which is why I am telling it, if I am honest about my own role in what happened. Honest about the decisions I made and why I made them. Honest about the things I chose not to look at closely enough. Because that is the part that is hardest to talk about. Not what she did, what I allowed. I am not, by nature or by training, a naive man. I want to establish that clearly, not as a defense, but as a fact that is necessary to understand the story accurately. I spent 34 years teaching history, which is in large part the study of human deception, political deception, institutional deception, the elaborate stories that individuals and nations construct to justify what they want to do. I have read more accounts of fraud and manipulation than most people encounter in a lifetime. I understand, at an intellectual level, how these things work. And I still lost $243,000. Because intellectual understanding is not immunity. Because knowing the mechanics of a thing is not the same as being protected from it. And because, and this is the part I have had the most time to think about, I was, in a specific and important way, willing. That word, willing. For the first time in 6 years, I was willing to believe that something good was happening to me. I was willing to trust. I was willing to be the person I had been before Carol died, the person who engaged with the world without constantly bracing for what it might take from him next. And that willingness, that specifically hard-won and earned willingness, was the thing Isabela needed. She had it identified from the beginning. I understand that now. The weeks of observing me at the restaurant before she said a word to me. The careful, patient building of trust. The 2 hours of listening on the terrace. All of it was architecture. I was the site. She was the builder. I don't say that with bitterness, exactly. I say it because it is accurate, and accuracy is what I can offer. We had been together, I use that word carefully, knowing now what I didn't know then, for a little over 4 months when she first mentioned Fabio in any substantive way. I had met him twice before that. He had come to meet Isabela for coffee one afternoon at a place near her office in Botafogo, and she had introduced me, and we had sat together for 40 minutes talking about nothing in particular. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his late 40s, with the specific confidence of someone who has been right about enough things to have stopped questioning his own instincts. He talked quickly and listens selectively, and had a way of referring to things he'd done, a project in Ipanema, an investment in Bara, with the casual authority of someone for whom these were simply part of the normal texture of life. I found him pleasant, a little slick, but pleasant. The opportunity came up on a Tuesday evening in mid-October. We were having dinner at a restaurant in Santa Teresa, and Isabela was talking about her week, a client who had been difficult, a venue that had fallen through for an event. And Fabio came up in the context of something he had mentioned to her. A property in Ipanema, a boutique hotel, partially renovated, the owner a man in his 70s who had run it since the 1990s and wanted to sell but needed to complete the renovation before the property would command the right price. Fabio was putting together a small group of investors, people he knew personally, 5 or 6 of them, each putting in between $30,000 and $50,000. 18 months, 15% return, all documented, all above board. She was not asking me to invest. She said this explicitly, and she said it first, before I had any chance to offer. She was telling me about it because Fabio had offered her a stake, and she was going back and forth about whether to participate. She talked through decisions out loud. It was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her, that quality of thinking in front of you rather than presenting you with conclusions, and she wanted to hear herself reason through it. She mentioned, as part of the reasoning, that she didn't quite have the liquidity right now because her daughter's school fees in Sao Paulo had increased significantly in September, which had tightened things more than she'd anticipated. I waited until she finished. Then I said, "How much is a stake?" She said $35,000. I said I would like to invest. She stopped. She put down her fork and looked at me with an expression I interpreted, in that moment, as concern. The expression of someone who is not intended to ask for something and is worried that they have asked for it anyway. She said, "Richard, I wasn't asking you for money. I need you to understand that. That's not what this was." I said I understood that. I said I had been thinking about what to do with a portion of my savings. It was sitting in an account, earning very little, which bothered me in the abstract way that wasted potential always bothered me, and a documented real estate investment in a city I was already living in, at 15% over 18 months, was a better option than anything I had found on my own. I said I had been looking for something like this. I said I wanted to do it. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said she would have Fabio contact me. He called the next morning, professional, methodical, The kind of man who has learned to answer questions before they are asked because he has answered them enough times to know which ones are coming. He emailed me a packet of documents, an investment agreement, a property summary, photographs of the hotel before the renovation, and, partway through, a projected completion timeline. I read everything. I am a thorough reader. I asked my Portuguese tutor, a woman named Claudia, who had been helping me with language for 3 months, to look over the legal language in the agreement. She said it appeared standard. I wired $35,000 to the account Fabio provided. For 3 weeks, nothing. Life continued in the way it had been continuing. The morning Portuguese study, the afternoon walks, the dinners with Isabela 2 or 3 times a week, the occasional Sunday lunch with Sebastião, who had taken to inviting me upstairs when he cooked something he wanted a second opinion on. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late November, Isabela came to the apartment. She did not call ahead, which was unusual. She was composed when I answered the door, but her composure had the quality of something being maintained at some effort. She came in and sat down at the small table in the kitchen and told me about her ex-husband. A legal dispute over the divorce settlement. A business asset, a small piece of real estate her ex-husband had owned at the time of their divorce, that he now claimed had been significantly undervalued in the settlement proceedings, and that his lawyer was arguing entitled him to additional compensation. Her own lawyer said the claim was without merit, but needed to be actively and expensively defended, because if she failed to respond to the court filing within 30 days, a default judgment could affect her work permits in ways that would effectively prevent her from continuing to operate her business. She needed $28,000. She could pay me back by February. There was a large corporate event she had contracted for January, a pharmaceutical company's annual conference, that would cover it and then some. She cried while she told me this. Not dramatically. I want to be precise about that, because dramatic crying would perhaps have activated some skepticism in me that quiet crying did not. She cried quietly, in the way of someone who is embarrassed to be crying, who has held it together through the week and is now in a moment of private disclosure, losing that grip. She said she had been going back and forth for 2 weeks about whether to tell me. She said she had no one else she trusted enough to ask. I thought about it for a full day. I did not make the decision impulsively. I thought about it carefully, which I mention not as evidence of due diligence, but as evidence of how thoroughly a person can think about the wrong question. I was asking myself whether I trusted Isabela, and the answer I arrived at was yes. I should have been asking whether the situation she was describing was real. That question did not occur to me, or rather, and I think this is more accurate, it occurred to me, and I set it aside. Because setting it aside felt, in that moment, like trust, and trust felt like love, and love felt like the thing I had spent 6 years trying to find my way back to. I wired $28,000. Things were normal for 6 weeks after that. Isabela mentioned the February repayment once, briefly, in passing, and I told her not to worry about it. She thanked me with a specificity and warmth that I found genuine, that I still believe was genuine, or as close to genuine as someone in her position could manage. Then, on a Monday morning in mid-December, Fabio called. His voice was measured, but I could hear something behind it, the specific quality of controlled urgency, of a man who needs something and is working to present the need calmly. He explained that one of the other investors in the hotel project had withdrawn, a family situation, a sudden need for liquidity, nothing to do with the investment itself. But the withdrawal had created a gap, and the property owner had a hard deadline. The renovation contractor had a penalty clause that activated at the end of the month, and if the full capital wasn't in place by then, the entire deal would collapse, and the existing investors, including me, would lose their positions. He said he needed $180,000 from me, in addition to the original $35,000, to cover the withdrawn investor's share and stabilize the deal. I said I needed time. He said he understood. He said he wished he could give me more of it. He said he was sorry to be putting me in this position. I asked for 48 hours. He agreed. I spent those 48 hours doing what I believed at the time was careful investigation. I searched for the hotel. I found a reference in a local real estate blog to a boutique hotel on a side street in Ipanema that had been undergoing renovation. I found what appeared to be a business registration matching the name Fabio had given me for the property company. I found photographs of a property that appeared to be mid-renovation, scaffolding and paint, and the particular disorder of a building being remade that Fabio had also included in his original investment documents. I found enough. That is the most honest way I can say it. I found enough to confirm the story without finding anything that challenged it, and I did not push harder than that, because pushing harder felt like distrust, and distrust felt like the opposite of what I had been trying to become. What I did not find, what was there to be found by someone looking more carefully, was the business registration that had been filed just 4 months earlier, not 3 years earlier, as Fabio had implied when we first discussed the hotel. Or the photographs that, had I run a reverse image search, would have appeared on the portfolio of a construction company based in Sao Paulo, documenting a project that had nothing to do with Ipanema. Or the hotel listing that matched no property on any short-term rental platform, because a functioning boutique hotel in Ipanema in 2022 would almost certainly have had such a listing. Those things were findable. I did not find them because I was not truly looking. I was performing the motions of due diligence while having already, somewhere beneath my careful reasoning, made the decision I wanted to make. I wired $180,000 in 2 transfers over 3 days. The Sunday morning I went to Isabela's apartment started as an ordinary Sunday. I had bought coffee at the bakery on the corner, her corner, a place she had mentioned once, early in our time together, as having the best pau de mel she had ever had, and I had bought a small box of pastries and was going to surprise her. We had talked the night before by phone. Everything had been normal. She had mentioned she was going to clean the apartment in the morning. She had mentioned the weather was going to be good and maybe we could walk down to the water in the afternoon. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, more firmly. Nothing. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. Not the emptiness of someone who has stepped out for coffee. The emptiness of removal. Systematic, complete removal. The furniture was gone. The sofa, the dining table, the chairs, the small bookshelf she kept by the door, the rug, the plants on the windowsill, 3 of them, a fern and 2 I had never learned the name of, the photographs on the shelf above the television, the coat hooks on the wall by the entrance, unscrewed, gone. There was a faint outline on the wall above where the sofa had been, a rectangle of slightly different paint tone, showing where something had hung for years before being taken down. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. I was trying to understand what I was looking at. My mind kept offering explanations. She had moved. There had been an emergency. The building had been sold. And another part of my mind kept quietly, methodically eliminating each explanation. I called her phone. It rang once and went to voicemail. Not her voicemail, the generic automated message. No name, no greeting. I called again. Same result. I called Fabio. The number was disconnected. I stood in the empty apartment for another few minutes. Through the window I could see the street outside, ordinary and indifferent. A man walking a dog, a woman carrying groceries, the particular Sunday morning unhurriedness of a neighborhood going about its business. Then I closed the door behind me and went to find a taxi. I went to the address in Botafogo where Isabela had told me her company was located. I had been there once, months earlier, to pick her up after a late event, or I had picked her up from a street I now understood was 2 blocks away from the address she had given me, and I had not particularly noticed the discrepancy at the time. The building at the address was a dental clinic. Clean, well-lit, a small sign on the door listing the dentists and their hours. A receptionist visible through the glass who looked up when I pushed on the locked door and pointed at a sign indicating the clinic was closed on Sundays. I went to the police the following morning. The officer who took my statement was a careful, deliberate man who asked good questions and wrote down everything I told him with the particular precision of someone who has heard this kind of story many times and understands that the details matter, even when the outcome will likely be the same. When I finished, he told me, in the professional, kind way of someone delivering an accurate prognosis, that cases of this type were unfortunately common and unfortunately difficult to pursue. That the names used were almost certainly false and the identities untraceable. That the bank accounts into which the wires had been sent were almost certainly empty and closed. That he had 3 similar reports from the previous 2 weeks alone. He was not unkind. He was honest. I respect honesty, even when it is not what I want to hear. I left the police station and sat on the steps outside for a while. The morning was clear and warm, the particular winter warmth of Rio that I had come to love, and the street in front of the station was going about its business. Taxis, pedestrians, a street vendor arranging fruit in careful pyramids. All of it completely normal. All of it completely indifferent to the fact that I had just finished understanding something that would take me a very long time to finish processing. The total was $243,000. $35,000 for the hotel investment, $28,000 for the legal situation, $180,000 for the accelerated capital call, and various smaller amounts over the course of 8 months. A birthday gift for Anna that Isabela had mentioned in passing and I had offered to help with, a trip to visit her mother in Recife that had cost more than expected, several dinners that I had insisted on paying for because I was the one who had more money and because it felt, at the time, like generosity. I still had $227,000. I want to be precise about that. I am not destitute. My pension continues at $2,100 a month. I am not sleeping on a street. I am not, by any reasonable definition, in desperate circumstances. But $243,000 is not just a number. It contains specifics that I find it impossible to make abstract. It contains the life insurance policy that Carol maintained for 20 years because she believed in being prepared for the things you cannot prevent. It contains the equity from the house in East Nashville where we raised our children. It contains, in some form I cannot entirely articulate, the physical residue of a life that she and I built together over 27 years. And I had given it to a woman who had been, from the beginning, performing a role, who had listened to me talk about Carol for 2 hours on a Friday night in Santa Teresa, and then used what I told her about the money I hadn't spent, about why I hadn't spent it, about what it represented, to construct a more convincing version of what I needed. I have had 8 months to sit with that. Some days I can hold it clearly. Other days it surprises me all over again. The same surprise, arriving fresh. I kept the apartment in Santa Teresa. I'm not entirely sure why. Possibly because Sebastião left mangoes outside my door the first week after it happened and didn't say anything about it. And that particular form of kindness was more than I could walk away from. Possibly because leaving felt like an acknowledgement that Rio had won something, and I have too much of the old stubbornness left to offer that. Patricia came in February. I had told her by phone what had happened, and she had been quiet for a long time, and then said she was coming. I told her not to. She came anyway, which is Patricia. She stayed for 2 weeks. She walked with me every day. She cooked in my apartment 3 evenings a week with the focused efficiency of someone who processes difficult emotions through action. She did not push me to talk about it, and she did not avoid it when I needed to. She was, as she has always been, reliable in the specific way that matters when reliability is what a situation requires. I went back to Doña Marlena's restaurant in March, 2.5 months after. I walked in on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at my usual table, and Doña Marlene brought the moqueca out without my asking, the way she always had, and sat down across from me for a moment, the way she sometimes did in the quiet between lunch and dinner. She looked at me, and then she looked at the table, and then she said, in Portuguese, slowly enough that I could follow it, "Some people are very good at pretending." I said, "Yes, I know that now." She said, "But you came back." I have thought about those 3 words almost every day since she said them. I think she meant several things at once. She always spoke that way, economically, with layers. She meant back to the restaurant. She meant back to Rio. She meant, I think, back to being a person who shows up somewhere regularly, who orders the same thing, who becomes, over time, part of the texture of a place. It is a modest thing to mean, but I've come to think that modest things are often the most important ones. I am 68 years old. I have $227,000 and a pension and an apartment in Santa Teresa with terracotta floors and a landlord who plays bossa nova on Sunday afternoons and leaves mangoes outside my door. I have a table at a restaurant in Gloria where the food is extraordinary, and the owner has known me long enough to bring my order without asking. I am taking a class in Brazilian history on Tuesday evenings at a cultural center in the neighborhood, run by a retired professor named Vera, who reminds me, in her precision and her patience, of the teacher I tried to be for 34 years. It is not the life I came to Rio to find. The life I came to find turned out not to exist, or rather, it existed only as a story. And the story cost me $243,000 to finish reading. But this life, the actual life, the one that remained when the story ended, this life is real. The moqueca is real. The mangoes are real. Vera's Tuesday evenings are real. The morning light through the wooden shutters, falling across the terracotta floor at the angle that makes the room look like it is from another century. That is real. I came back. I don't know entirely what that means, but I think Carol would understand it. She understood the things I couldn't quite put into words. It was one of the things she was best at. She sounds like she was remarkable. She was. She really was.